In 1875, under the brutal Texas sun, Lila Mercer, a young schoolteacher, stood bound in the center of town, being auctioned for a single sack of grain. Hunger had turned neighbors into silent witnesses and morality into a luxury no one could afford. Just as her dignity teetered on the edge of collapse, a lone cowboy named Rowan Hale stepped forward, calm, unshaken, and drew a line the town had forgotten existed. This is a story of survival, choice, and the moment one person's courage changed everything. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The heat made everything worse. It wasn't just the sun beating down on the wooden platform in the center of Hackberry's main street, though that was brutal enough. It was the way the heat seemed to press against the silence, thickening it, making every breath feel like an effort. The crowd stood in scattered clusters, faces shadowed by hat brims, eyes downcast or fixed somewhere middle distance, anywhere but on the woman standing on that platform. Lila Mercer had stopped shaking about 20 minutes ago. She'd gone through the trembling phase when they first brought her out, when the reality of what was happening had hit her like a fist to the stomach. Then came the tears, silent and useless, streaming down her dust-coated cheeks. But now, standing with her wrists bound in front of her, and her dress torn at the shoulder from where Clayton Webb had grabbed her too roughly, she felt something else settling in. Numbness, maybe. Or just the hollow understanding that nobody was coming to stop this. "We'll start the bidding at 1 sack of grain," announced Mayor Hutchins, his voice lacking its usual pompous authority. He couldn't quite meet her eyes either. "Good, strong woman here. Can read and write. Knows her numbers." Lila wanted to laugh at that. Good, strong woman. As if she were livestock. As if the months she'd spent teaching the children of this town to read hadn't meant a damn thing when hunger started gnawing at everyone's bellies. The drought had been going on for 8 months now. 8 months of watching the land turn from brown to gray to something that looked like the surface of the moon. 8 months of watching cattle die, crops fail, wells run dry. 8 months of desperation slowly eroding every principle these people claimed to hold. Still, she'd never imagined it would come to this. "1 sack," someone called out. Lila couldn't see who. Didn't want to see who. "We got 1 sack of grain," Hutchins said, and she could hear the relief in his voice that someone had actually bid. "Do I hear 2?" Silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere a baby cried, the sound thin and weak. Lila's eyes found the child's mother, Mary Sullivan, whose daughter had just learned to write her own name 3 weeks ago. Mary's face was turned away, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Going once for 1 sack of grain," Hutchins called out. This was really happening. Someone was going to buy her, own her, and the law wouldn't do a thing about it because technically this was a work contract to settle her debts. Clayton Webb, the merchant who'd held the deed to her small schoolhouse, had called in every penny she owed after his own creditors came knocking. When she couldn't pay, he'd convinced the town council that this was the only solution, the legal solution. Lila had always thought the worst thing that could happen was being poor. She'd been wrong. The worst thing was discovering that your humanity had a price, and that price was negotiable. "Going twice? I'll take her." The voice came from the back of the crowd, and something in its tone made everyone turn. Lila looked up, squinting against the glare. A man was pushing through the clustered townspeople, and they parted for him like water around a stone. He was tall, taller than most men she'd seen, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and years. He wore dusty range clothes and moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. Lila had seen him around town maybe twice in the past year. Rowan Hale. He ran cattle on the land west of town, kept to himself mostly. She'd heard he was fair with his men, paid on time, didn't drink to excess. That was about all anyone knew. "Mr. Hale?" Hutchins said, and there was surprise in his voice. "You're bidding?" "No," Rowan said flatly. He reached the platform and stopped, looking up at Lila with eyes that were an unsettling shade of gray. "I'm not bidding." Hutchins blinked. "I don't understand. This stops now." Rowan's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. "Whatever the hell you people think you're doing here, it stops. Now wait just a minute." Clayton Webb pushed forward, his face already flushing red beneath his store-bought hat. "This is a legal proceeding. The woman owes debts." "She taught your children to read," Rowan interrupted, his gaze sliding to Webb with something cold in it. For almost nothing, from what I hear. And now you're selling her like a mule. The law. Rowan's mouth twisted. You mean the law you all decided to interpret real convenient like when it suited you? When your own pockets got light? A ripple of discomfort went through the crowd. Someone coughed. Lila stood frozen on the platform, afraid to hope, afraid to believe what she was seeing. Mr. Hale, I understand you're upset, Hutchins said, trying to regain control of the situation. But we have procedures. If you want to place a bid, I told you, I'm not bidding. Rowan stepped up onto the platform in one smooth movement. He was close enough now that Lila could see the lines around his eyes, the scar above his left eyebrow. Because she's not property. She's a person. And if you all can't see that anymore, then you've lost more than your crops to this drought. He reached for Lila's bound wrists, and she flinched before she could stop herself. His hands paused, and for a moment their eyes met. His expression shifted. Something like understanding crossed his face. I'm going to cut the rope, he said quietly, just to her. That all right with you? The question broke something inside her chest. When was the last time someone had asked her permission for anything? She managed a nod. He drew a knife from his belt, a working blade, worn and practical, and sliced through the rope in one quick motion. The hemp fell away, and Lila's hands dropped to her sides, wrists burning and raw. This is highly irregular, Hutchins sputtered. You can't just... Can't I? Rowan turned to face the crowd, and Lila realized he'd positioned himself between her and everyone else. Someone want to try and stop me? Silence, the kind that felt like a held breath. Clayton Webb's face had gone from red to purple. She owes money. Legal debts. You can't just walk away from... How much? Rowan asked. Webb blinked. What? How much does she owe you? $47, Webb said, lifting his chin. For rent on the schoolhouse and supplies she took on credit. Rowan reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out bills with deliberate precision, 1, 2, 3, and then stepped down from the platform to shove them into Webb's hands. 50, he said. Keep the change. Webb stared at the money like it might bite him. Around them, the crowd had gone very quiet. Now her debt's settled, Rowan said, his voice carrying across the street. No more auction. No more of this. He looked at each face in turn, and Lila watched grown men look away. You all ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Nobody argued. Nobody moved. Rowan turned back to the platform and offered Lila his hand. Can you walk? She looked at his outstretched palm, calloused, scarred, steady, and something in her chest cracked open. She took his hand and let him help her down. Her legs shook as her feet hit the dusty street, but she stayed upright. Barely. My things, she heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange, scraped raw. They're at the schoolhouse. What's left of them? We'll get them, Rowan said. He hadn't let go of her hand yet, and she found she didn't want him to. It was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth right now. They started walking, the crowd parting before them. Lila kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at any of the faces she'd once known. Faces that had watched her children learn, had nodded politely when she passed on the street, had promised to pay her teaching wages and then conveniently forgotten when times got hard. Miss Mercer. The voice made her stop. She turned to find Mary Sullivan standing at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Mary whispered. I'm so sorry. I wanted to... We needed the grain, and I thought... Her voice broke. I'm sorry. Lila looked at her for a long moment. At the baby on Mary's hip, thin and hollow-eyed. At the desperation carved into every line of the woman's face. I know, Lila said finally. It wasn't forgiveness. She didn't have that in her yet. But it was understanding, and maybe that was something. They kept walking. The schoolhouse was the small, sad building at the east end of town. One room, wooden benches Lila had spent hours sanding smooth so the children wouldn't get splinters. A blackboard she'd painted herself on the wall. Shelves that had once held books, real books, shipped all the way from St. Louis, though most of those were gone now, sold or traded when the drought began. Her few possessions fit in a single carpet bag. 2 dresses, a shawl, her mother's Bible, and a small wooden box containing letters from her sister back east. Rowan waited by the door while she gathered everything. He didn't rush her, didn't speak, just stood there like a windbreak, solid and quiet. When she emerged, bag in hand, he gestured toward a horse tied at the rail. "Can you ride?" "Yes." She'd learned as a girl, though it had been years. He swung up into the saddle and then reached down to pull her up behind him. She hesitated only a second before taking his hand and letting him haul her up. She settled behind him, the carpet bag clutched in one arm, the other hand gripping his shoulder for balance. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My place. The ranch." He glanced back at her. "You got anywhere else?" She shook her head. The schoolhouse had been her home. She had no family here, no friends who would risk their own survival to help her. "Then that's where we're going," he said simply. "You can stay as long as you need." He urged the horse forward, and Hackberry began to fall away behind them. Lila turned to look back one last time at the town that had taught her exactly how much, or how little, a human life was worth when people got scared enough. The ride took almost 2 hours. Rowan didn't talk much, which suited Lila fine. She wasn't sure she had words yet for what had just happened. Her mind kept circling back to those moments on the platform, to the feeling of rope cutting into her wrists, to the knowledge that people she'd trusted had been willing to trade her away for grain. The land they crossed was brutal in its desolation. Cracked earth stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional skeletal tree or clump of dead grass. She'd seen drought before. Everyone in Texas had, but nothing like this. This looked like the land itself was dying. "How are you managing?" she asked finally, because the silence was starting to feel too heavy. "With the drought, I mean. If the town's so desperate they'd—" She couldn't finish that sentence. "It's bad," Rowan admitted. "Lost about half my herd. Had to let 2 men go because I couldn't pay them and feed the cattle both." He was quiet for a moment. "But I'm not desperate enough to forget what's right. Not yet, anyway." The way he said "not yet" sent a chill through her despite the heat. Even this man, this stranger who'd just saved her, knew that everyone had a breaking point. The ranch appeared gradually, rising out of the landscape like a mirage. A main house, low and sprawling, built from weathered wood and stone. A barn that had seen better days. Corrals holding maybe a dozen cattle that looked gaunt and miserable. Everything wore a coat of dust so thick it looked like the color had been leached out of the world. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, middle-aged, Mexican, with a face that looked carved from mahogany. He took in the sight of Rowan riding in with a woman behind him, and his eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. "Javier," Rowan said, swinging down from the saddle. "This is Miss Mercer. She'll be staying with us for a while." Javier's eyes flicked to Lila, taking in her torn dress, her raw wrists, her hollow expression. Understanding dawned in his face, followed quickly by anger. "The town?" he asked quietly. "Yeah." Javier swore in Spanish, long and creative. Then he looked up at Lila and his expression softened. "Welcome, señorita. We don't have much, but what we have is yours." Rowan helped her down from the horse with the same careful consideration he'd shown on the platform. "Come on, I'll show you where you can stay." He led her into the house, through a main room that was Spartan but clean, and down a short hallway to a small bedroom. It held a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that looked out over the empty land. "It's not much," Rowan said, sounding almost apologetic. Lila set down her carpet bag and turned to look at him. Really look at him, this stranger who'd stepped out of the crowd and changed everything. "Why?" she asked. The question had been building in her chest for the past 2 hours. "Why did you do that? You don't know me. We've never even spoken before." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. 5 years ago I was in Abilene, saw something similar happen, not exactly the same, but close enough. A woman being sold to settle her husband's debts after he died. Whole town standing around watching, and He stopped, jaw working. "I didn't do anything. Told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just passing through." He looked at her then, and the weight in his eyes was almost physical. "I still see her face sometimes," he said. "Still wonder what happened to her. If she survived, if she—" He shook his head. "I swore if I ever saw something like that again, I wouldn't just stand there. I wouldn't be one of the silent ones." Lila felt something shift in her chest. Not gratitude. She wasn't ready for that yet. but something like recognition. He'd seen her. When everyone else had looked away, he'd seen her as a person, not a problem to be solved or a burden to be traded. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, sharp. "Get some rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He left, pulling the door closed behind him. Lila stood in the center of the small room, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then, finally alone, she sank down onto the bed and let herself fall apart. The sobs came from somewhere deep, a place she'd been holding shut for months. Since the drought started, since the town council had told her they couldn't pay her anymore, since Clayton Webb had smiled his oily smile and told her she could work off her debt one way or another. She cried until she had nothing left, until the light outside the window had turned orange and long, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen. Then she lay there, staring at the ceiling, and tried to figure out who she was now. Not Lila Mercer, schoolteacher. That woman had died on a platform in the center of town. Not Lila Mercer, daughter and sister. Those people were hundreds of miles away and might as well have been on the moon for all the help they could offer. So who was she? A knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She sat up quickly, wiping at her face. "Yes?" The door cracked open and a woman's face appeared, older, maybe 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Elena," the woman said, her accent thick and warm. "Javier's wife. I brought you some supper." She came in carrying a tray with a bowl of thin stew and a piece of cornbread. Lila's stomach twisted at the sight of food, hunger and nausea fighting for dominance. "I'm not sure I can—" "You'll eat," Elena said firmly, setting the tray down on the washstand. "Not much, maybe, but something. You need strength." She turned to look at Lila, really look at her, and Lila had the strange sensation of being seen all the way through to her bones. "What happened to you today?" Elena said quietly. "It was wrong. Wicked. But you survived it." She reached out and touched Lila's shoulder, gentle but solid. "Now you have to decide what comes next." "I don't know what comes next," Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one ever does," Elena said. "But that's all right. You don't have to know everything. You just have to know the next thing. And right now the next thing is eating that stew before it gets cold." She left as quietly as she'd come, and Lila found herself staring at the bowl of stew. It smelled good, onions and some kind of meat, though probably not much of it. Her stomach growled despite everything. She picked up the spoon and took a bite, then another. The food was simple but hot, and it anchored her somehow, reminded her body that it was still alive, still functioning. She was halfway through the bowl when she heard voices from the main room, Rowan, Javier, and Elena, speaking in low tones. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was familiar. They were talking about her, trying to figure out what to do with this unexpected addition to their struggling household. Lila set down the spoon and looked at her reflection in the small, dusty mirror hanging above the washstand. Her face was thinner than it used to be, cheekbones sharp beneath her skin. Her hair was a mess, tangled and full of dust. Her dress was torn and dirty, but her eyes were still her own, still sharp, still alive. Elena had said she had to decide what came next. For months, Lila had let things happen to her. Let the drought dictate her choices. Let the town council cut her wages. Let Clayton Webb back her into a corner. Let fear and desperation narrow her world down to nothing but survival. Well, she'd survived. Against all odds and expectations, she'd survived. Now what? The question hung in the small room like smoke. Lila finished her stew, set the bowl aside, and lay back down on the narrow bed. Outside her window, the sun was setting, painting the drought-stricken land in shades of red and gold that almost made it look beautiful. Almost. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine tomorrow. Tried to picture herself getting up, walking out into that main room, facing Rowan and Javier and Elena. Tried to see past the shame and fear that still clung to her like a second skin. It was hard, harder than it should have been. But she'd done hard things before. She'd left her family back east to come out here and teach. She'd built a schoolhouse from nothing. She'd taught children whose parents couldn't read to love books and learning. She'd survived things she'd never thought she could survive. She could do this too. Probably. Maybe. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams that felt more like memories. The platform, the rope, The faces of people she'd trusted, looking anywhere but at her. Clayton Webb's smile. The heat pressing down like a physical weight. And then, cutting through it all, a voice. Calm. Steady. Drawing a line. This stops now. Lila woke in the dark, disoriented and gasping. For a moment she didn't know where she was, only that she wasn't on that platform anymore, wasn't bound and waiting to be sold. She sat up slowly, letting her eyes adjust. The small room came into focus around her, safe, quiet, hers for now at least. From somewhere outside, a coyote called out into the night. The sound was lonely and wild and somehow comforting, life persisting even in the wasteland. Lila lay back down and pulled the faded quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. All she could do was meet it, and maybe, just maybe, figure out who Lila Mercer was going to be on the other side of the worst day of her life. Morning came too early and too bright. Lila woke to sunlight cutting through the window like a blade, and for a few blessed seconds she didn't remember where she was or why. Then it all crashed back, the platform, the rope, the faces turned away, and her stomach lurched. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body aching like she'd been beaten. Maybe she had been, in a way. Just not with fists. Someone had left a pitcher of water and a clean cloth on the washstand. Lila poured water into the basin and scrubbed at her face, her neck, her raw wrists. The water turned gray with dust. She looked at her reflection again, still gaunt, still haunted, but marginally cleaner. Her two dresses were both in rough shape. She chose the one with fewer tears, shook out the worst of the dust, and pulled it on. Her hands trembled as she worked the buttons. The smell of coffee drifted down the hallway, and her stomach growled despite her nerves. She'd barely eaten yesterday. If she was going to figure out what came next, she needed to be able to think straight. The main room was empty when she emerged, but she could hear voices outside. Rowan's low rumble and Javier's quicker Spanish-accented replies. She followed the sound and found them by the barn examining one of the horses. Rowan looked up as she approached, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity, exactly. More like careful assessment. "Morning," he said. "You sleep all right?" It was such a normal question that Lila almost laughed. "I slept," she said, which was true enough. Javier nodded to her, his face kind. "There's coffee in the kitchen. Elena made biscuits." "Thank you." She hesitated, feeling suddenly awkward. "I don't mean to be a burden. I should help with something, earn my keep." Rowan straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. "You're not a burden, and you don't owe us anything." "I owe you $50, Lila said flatly. "That was for Webb, not for you." He studied her for a moment. "But if it'd make you feel better to help out around here, we won't say no. Place is barely holding together as it is." It would make her feel better. She needed to do something with her hands, her mind, anything to stop the endless replay of yesterday's humiliation. "What needs doing?" she asked. Javier and Rowan exchanged a glance. Then Javier said, "The chickens need feeding. Garden needs weeding, though there's not much growing in it. Kitchen could use organizing. Elena's been too busy keeping us all fed to tidy up properly." Normal things, ordinary things. Lila grabbed onto them like a lifeline. "I'll start with the chickens," she said. The chicken coop was around the back of the house, a ramshackle structure that looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. Inside, a half-dozen scraggly hens scratched at the dirt with the desperate determination of creatures who knew food was scarce. Lila found the feed bucket, mostly empty, just a scattering of grain at the bottom, and scattered it for the birds. They descended on it like locusts, pecking and squabbling. She watched them for a moment, these small survivors fighting for every scrap. She knew the feeling. They're stubborn little things. Lila turned to find Elena standing at the coop door, a basket on her hip. "Still laying?" Lila asked. "A few eggs. Not many." Elena came inside and began checking the nesting boxes. "But we make do." She glanced at Lila. "How are your wrists?" Lila looked down at the raw, rope-burned skin. "They'll heal." "The body heals faster than the spirit," Elena said quietly. She pulled 2 small eggs from a nest and placed them carefully in her basket. "Give yourself time." "I don't know if I have time," Lila admitted. "I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out—" She stopped, not sure how to finish. "What you're going to do next." Elena's smile was understanding. That's the question, isn't it? But maybe you don't need to answer it today. Maybe today you just feed the chickens and weed the garden and drink your coffee while it's hot. It sounded almost too simple, but maybe simple was what Lila needed right now. She spent the morning working, feeding the chickens, pulling weeds from the struggling garden, sweeping the kitchen floor. The physical labor felt good, gave her something to focus on besides the voices in her head telling her she was ruined, worthless, damaged beyond repair. Around midday, Elena called her in for lunch. It was another thin meal, cornbread and beans, but Lila ate every bite. Rowan and Javier came in from whatever work they'd been doing, dusty and tired, and the four of them sat around the worn wooden table in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. "You grew up around here?" Rowan asked eventually, looking at Lila. "No, Missouri, originally. Came out to Texas 3 years ago to teach." She pushed a bean around her plate. "My sister married a man in St. Louis, sent me letters saying how wonderful city life was, how many opportunities there were for women with education." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I wanted something different. Wanted to make a difference, I guess. Thought teaching on the frontier would be meaningful." "It was meaningful," Javier said firmly. "Those children learned because of you. And their parents sold me for grain." The words came out harsher than she'd intended. Javier's face darkened, but he didn't argue. How could he? They all knew it was true. "People do terrible things when they're scared," Elena said quietly. "Doesn't make it right, but understanding why doesn't cost us anything." Lila wasn't sure she had any understanding to spare right now, but she nodded anyway. After lunch, Rowan asked if she could ride out with him to check on the cattle. "Could use an extra pair of eyes," he said. "And you look like you could use some air." He wasn't wrong. The house felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. They rode out together into the bleached landscape, and Lila tried not to think about the last time she'd been on a horse with him, fleeing Hackberry with her dignity in tatters. This time was different. She was behind him again, but she'd chosen to be here. That made all the difference. The cattle were scattered across a section of land that might have been pasture once, but was now just cracked earth and dead grass. They looked worse up close, ribs showing, eyes dull and listless. "How much longer can you keep them alive?" Lila asked. "Maybe a month? 2, if we're lucky." Rowan dismounted and walked among the animals, checking them with practiced efficiency. "After that," he didn't finish. "After that, you'll have nothing. After that, I'll have less than nothing. I'll have debt I can't pay and land that's worthless." He ran a hand over one cow's flank, and the animal didn't even have the energy to move away. "Been ranching this land for 8 years. Thought I knew what I was doing. Turns out the land doesn't care what you know." Lila slid down from the horse and walked over to stand beside him. "Why didn't you leave? Go somewhere with water, with grass. And do what? Start over with nothing?" He shook his head. "This is my land, my home. Can't just walk away from that." She understood that. She'd felt the same way about her schoolhouse, right up until the moment they dragged her out of it. "Sometimes walking away is the only choice that makes sense," she said quietly. Rowan looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared stubbornness, maybe, or shared foolishness. "Yeah," he said finally. "Sometimes it is, but I'm not there yet." They finished checking the cattle and rode back as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. The heat was still brutal, but there was a quality to the light now, a golden softness that made even the wasteland look almost beautiful. "Can I ask you something?" Lila said as they rode. "Sure." "Yesterday, when you stepped up on that platform," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Were you scared? Of what might happen?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment. "Terrified," he admitted. "Thought Webb might shoot me, or the crowd might turn, or a dozen other things that could have gone wrong. But you did it anyway. Seemed like the only choice." He glanced back at her. "Sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same. You just have to pick which one you can live with." That night, Elena taught Lila how to make tortillas from their dwindling supply of flour. It was harder than it looked. Getting the dough the right consistency, rolling them thin and even, cooking them on the hot griddle without burning. "You're thinking too much," Elena said, watching Lila struggle with the rolling pin. "Let your hands remember, they know what to do." "My hands know how to hold a piece of chalk and write on a blackboard," Lila said. "This is different." "All work is the same," Elena said. "You learn the rhythm, and then the rhythm carries you." Lila tried to find the rhythm, and after a dozen misshapen attempts, something clicked. The tortilla rolled out round and thin, and when she laid it on the griddle, it puffed up perfectly. "There," Elena said, smiling. "See? You can do hard things." It was such a small accomplishment, one decent tortilla, but Lila felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, maybe. Or just the simple satisfaction of doing something well. They ate dinner around the table again, and this time Lila contributed food she'd helped make. It felt good. It felt like she was part of something instead of just a burden to be carried. After dinner, Javier pulled out a battered guitar and started playing. Old Mexican songs that Lila didn't know, but that made Elena's face soften with memory. Rowan sat by the window, cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Lila found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to figure him out. He was hard to read, quiet and self-contained in a way that seemed deliberate, like he'd learned that showing too much was dangerous. She understood that too. "You play?" Javier asked, gesturing to the guitar. "A little. Piano, mostly, but that was years ago." "Music is like tortillas," Elena said with a smile. "Your hands remember." Javier handed her the guitar, and Lila took it gingerly. It had been so long since she'd held an instrument. Her fingers found the strings, and she picked out a simple melody, something her mother had taught her as a child. It was clumsy and hesitant, but it was music. And for those few minutes, the world narrowed down to just the sound and the feel of the strings under her fingers. When she finished, Rowan was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was nice," he said simply. 3 days passed in a similar rhythm. Lila worked, feeding chickens, helping Elena in the kitchen, mending clothes, pulling weeds from the dying garden. The physical labor exhausted her, but in a good way. At night she slept hard and dreamless, too tired for nightmares. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just marking time, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on the 4th morning. Lila was in the kitchen helping Elena prepare breakfast when they heard horses approaching. A lot of horses. Rowan appeared in the doorway, his face tense. "Stay inside," he said. But Lila followed him to the door anyway, Elena right behind her. Through the window, she could see 6 riders approaching the house. At the front was Clayton Webb, looking pleased with himself in a way that made Lila's stomach turn. Rowan stepped out onto the porch, and Lila watched from the doorway. Javier emerged from the barn, his hand resting casually near the knife at his belt. "Webb," Rowan said, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "Just came to have a conversation," Webb said, reining in his horse. The men behind him spread out slightly, not quite threatening, but not friendly either. "About property rights and legal contracts." "Already paid you her debt," Rowan said. "We're done." "Well, see, that's where it gets complicated." Webb pulled a paper from his vest. "I've been consulting with a lawyer up in Fort Worth. Turns out the sale was legal. That money you gave me? That was just payment for her contract, which means I still own it." Lila felt her blood go cold. "And I'm well within my rights to collect on that contract," Webb continued, "so I'm here to retrieve my property." "She's not property," Rowan said, and there was steel in his voice now. "She's a person. She's a woman who signed a work agreement to settle her debts," Webb said. "Law's real clear on that, and I've got the sheriff's backing on this one." One of the riders behind Webb moved his coat aside slightly, revealing a badge. Lila recognized him, Tom Bradshaw, Hackberry's sheriff. A man who'd always struck her as more interested in avoiding trouble than enforcing justice. "Sheriff," Rowan said, not taking his eyes off Webb, "you really going to stand behind this?" Bradshaw looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. "Law's the law, Hale. Contract's valid. Webb's got every right to enforce it." "This is wrong," Javier said, stepping closer. "You know it's wrong." "Don't much matter what I know," Bradshaw said. "Matters what's legal." Lila felt Elena's hand on her shoulder, firm and steadying. But her own hands were shaking, and her mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. She'd thought she was safe here. She'd thought, "No." The word came out before Lila fully realized she was speaking. Everyone turned to look at her. She stepped out onto the porch, standing beside Rowan. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to hold steady. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, looking directly at Webb. "You can wave that paper around all you want. I'm not leaving. Webb's smile widened. Now, Lila, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. You signed a contract, you owe me labor, and I'm here to collect. I signed that contract under duress, Lila said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. You gave me a choice between signing and being thrown in jail for unpaid debts. That's not a real choice, that's coercion. You got a lawyer who says different? Webb asked. I don't need a lawyer to know right from wrong. Maybe not, but you need one to fight this in court. Webb's expression turned smug. And we both know you can't afford that. He was right, and they both knew it. Lila felt her brief spark of defiance starting to flicker. Then Rowan stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of her. She's not going with you, he said quietly. You can't stop me from taking what's legally mine, Webb said. Watch me. The air went very still. The men behind Webb shifted in their saddles. Bradshaw's hand moved toward his gun. Rowan, Javier said softly. Careful. But Rowan didn't move. You want her, you go through me. Webb's face flushed red. You'd really risk everything, your land, your life, for some woman you barely know? For what's right? Rowan's voice was level. Yeah, I would. For a long moment, nobody moved. Lila could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. Then Bradshaw cleared his throat. Hale, you're putting me in a bad position here. You put yourself there, Rowan said. You and every other person in Hackberry who watched this happen and did nothing. I'm just trying to keep the peace. There's no peace in this, Rowan interrupted. There's just you choosing the easy path over the right one, like you always do. Bradshaw's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Webb, sensing the standoff might not go his way, tried a different tactic. Look, Hale, I'm a reasonable man. I don't want trouble. I just want what I'm owed. How about we work out a deal? You pay me, say, another $100, and we'll call her contract fulfilled. Everyone walks away happy. How about you take your forged contract and get off my land before I throw you off? Rowan countered. Forged? Webb sputtered. That's slander. Prove it's not. Show me where she signed it willingly, without you threatening her first. Lila's mind raced. She remembered that day in Webb's office, the way he'd smiled while explaining her options. Sign the contract or face arrest. Work off the debt or lose everything. She'd signed because she'd been scared and alone and out of choices. I was there, she said suddenly. When I signed, Mr. Webb told me if I didn't sign, he'd have me arrested for theft. Said I'd taken goods on credit I couldn't pay for. Said the sheriff would haul me off to jail that same day. That's a lie, Webb said quickly. Too quickly. Is it? Lila took a step forward. Because I remember it pretty clearly. You were sitting behind your desk and there was a bottle of whiskey on the corner, the expensive kind you keep for special customers. You poured yourself a glass before you told me my choices. She met his eyes. Want me to keep going, or should I tell the sheriff about the other things you said? The suggestions you made about how I could work off the debt if I was willing to be friendly? Webb's face went from red to purple. You little... Careful, Rowan said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Real careful how you finish that sentence. Bradshaw was watching Webb now with new suspicion. That true, Clayton? You threaten her? She's making it up. She's desperate. She'll say anything. Seems to me the desperate one here is you, Bradshaw said slowly. Coming out here with 5 men to collect on a contract for one woman that strike anyone else as excessive? One of the men behind Webb shifted uncomfortably. Didn't know there was any question about the contract being legit, he muttered. There isn't, Webb insisted. She signed it. That's all that matters. Under threat of arrest, Lila said, which makes it invalid. You got proof of that? Webb demanded. Do you have proof I didn't? Lila shot back. Because I'm willing to swear to what happened in that office, under oath, in front of a judge. Are you? The silence that followed was heavy and telling. Bradshaw sighed. Clayton, I think maybe we should take this back to town. Let a judge sort it out proper. The hell we will, Webb started, but Bradshaw cut him off. The hell we will, the sheriff said firmly. I'm not dragging anyone off their property based on a contract that might not be worth the paper it's printed on. If you want to pursue this legal-like, you file the proper paperwork and we'll have a hearing. But I'm not doing this today. Webb looked like he might explode. You're letting her get away with... With what? Speaking up for herself? Bradshaw shook his head. Come on, we're going back to town. For a moment, Lila thought Webb might refuse, might push this into violence, but then he yanked his horse's reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head and turned back toward Hackberry. This isn't over, he called back. I'll get a judge involved. I'll get a marshal if I have to. You can't just ignore the law because you don't like it. Neither can you, Rowan called back. That's the whole point. They watched the riders disappear into the heat shimmer, and only when they were completely out of sight did Lila let herself breathe properly. Her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the porch step. Rowan crouched beside her immediately. You all right? I don't know. Her hands were shaking again. Is he right? Can he really force me back? Not if we fight it, Rowan said. Not if you're willing to stand up in front of a judge and tell what really happened. I am. She looked at him. I'm done being silent, done letting people like him decide what happens to me. Something flickered in Rowan's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Good, he said simply. Elena came out with water and Lila drank it gratefully. Javier stood at the edge of the porch, his eyes still on the horizon like he expected Webb to come back. He'll try again, Javier said. Men like that always do. Let him try, Rowan said. Next time we'll be ready. That night they sat around the table making plans. Rowan knew a lawyer in Fort Worth, a man who'd helped him with land disputes before. It would cost money they didn't have, but Rowan insisted they'd figure it out. Why are you doing this? Lila asked him at one point. You already saved me once. You don't owe me anything else. Rowan looked at her across the table, his gray eyes steady. Maybe I'm not doing it for you. Maybe I'm doing it for me. For the man in Abilene who didn't step up when he should have. That wasn't your fault. Doesn't matter whose fault it was. What matters is what I do now. Lila understood that. She'd spent so much time feeling guilty about things that weren't her fault. The drought, the town's desperation, Clayton Webb's greed. But Elena was right. Understanding why didn't cost anything. The days that followed settled into a new normal. They worked the ranch, such as it was. They ate thin meals and made dark jokes about the drought. They waited for word from the lawyer, from Webb, from anyone who might tip the scales one way or another. And slowly, carefully, Lila started to rebuild something inside herself. Not the person she'd been before. That woman was gone, burned away on a platform in the center of town. But maybe someone new. Someone harder and softer at the same time. Someone who'd learned that the worst could happen and you could still wake up the next morning and feed the chickens. One evening, about 2 weeks after Webb's visit, Lila was helping Javier repair a section of fence when he said, You know, you remind me of my daughter. Lila looked up, surprised. She hadn't known Javier had a daughter. She's back in Mexico, he continued, his hands never stopping their work. Married a good man, has 3 children. But when she was young, she had fire. Wouldn't let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. He smiled. Drove me crazy sometimes, but I was proud of her. Why did you leave? Lila asked. Revolution, Javier said simply. Things got bad. We came north looking for safety, for work. Found it here, for a while at least. Do you ever think about going back? Every day. But this is my home now, too. Strange how you can belong to 2 places at once. Lila thought about that as they worked. She'd never really belonged anywhere, she realized. Missouri had been her childhood, but she'd left it behind eagerly. Texas had been a dream of purpose and meaning, but that dream had turned sour. And now here she was on a failing ranch in the middle of a drought, and somehow this felt more like home than anywhere else ever had. It didn't make sense, but maybe it didn't have to. That night, unable to sleep, Lila found herself standing on the porch looking at the stars. They were brilliant out here, away from any town lights, countless and cold and indifferent to human suffering. Can't sleep either? She turned to find Rowan in the doorway, 2 cups in his hands. He offered her one, coffee, bitter, and strong. Too much thinking, she admitted. Yeah, I know that problem. He came to stand beside her, not too close but not distant either. What are you thinking about? Everything. Nothing. What happens if Webb wins? What happens if he doesn't? What I'm supposed to do with my life now that teaching is... She trailed off. Is what? Ruined. Tainted. I can't go back to Hackberry. Can't get another teaching position without references, and who's going to give me references after what happened? Someone who knows what really happened, Rowan said. Someone who sees past the gossip and lies. You're awfully optimistic for a man whose ranch is dying. He laughed, short and sharp. Maybe we're both just stubborn enough to keep hoping even when we shouldn't. They stood in silence for a while, drinking their coffee and watching the stars. Can I tell you something? Lila said eventually. Sure. When I was on that platform, when they were deciding what I was worth, she stopped, swallowed hard. I kept thinking about my mother. She died when I was 15. Cancer. It took months and it was horrible, but at least she got to die with dignity. At least people treated her like a person right up until the end. She looked at her hands. And I thought she'd be so ashamed of me, standing there, letting them sell me like livestock. She'd be proud of you, Rowan said firmly. How do you figure? Because you survived. Because you're still fighting. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Lila wanted to believe him, wanted to feel proud instead of dirty. But shame had roots that went deep. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest, Rowan said. What do you want? Not what you think you should want or what would make sense. What do you actually want? Lila thought about it, really thought about it. I want to teach again, she said finally, not in Hackberry, not anywhere I have to worry about people knowing what happened, but somewhere I can make a difference. Help kids learn to read and think and question things. She paused. And I want to stop feeling like I'm one bad day away from losing everything again. That's not too much to ask, Rowan said. Isn't it? In a drought? In a place where people sell each other for grain? Maybe? But we're still asking anyway. He looked at her. That's what hope is, right? Asking for things even when the answer might be no. Lila smiled despite herself. Is that what we're doing? Hoping? Trying to, at least. They finished their coffee and went back inside, and Lila fell asleep thinking about hope and dignity and the strange comfort of being understood by someone who'd seen you at your worst and still thought you were worth saving. The letter from the lawyer arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a rider who looked half dead from the heat. Rowan tore it open on the porch while Lila, Elena, and Javier watched. His face didn't change as he read, which somehow made it worse. Well? Javier finally asked. He'll take the case, Rowan said. Says we've got a solid argument about coercion, but he needs $100 up front, another $100 if it goes to trial. $200. Lila felt the number settle in her chest like a stone. Rowan had already paid $50 to Webb. The ranch was barely surviving. Where would they find that kind of money? I can't ask you to do this, she said quietly. You're not asking, I'm offering. Rowan folded the letter and looked at her. We'll figure it out. But figuring it out proved harder than any of them wanted to admit. Rowan had maybe $30 in cash, plus whatever he could get for selling the remaining cattle. But cattle prices had crashed with the drought. Everyone was trying to sell. Nobody was buying. The best offer he got was $15 for the entire herd. Highway robbery, Javier muttered when Rowan told them. Those animals are worth 10 times that. Not in a drought they're not, Rowan said. Not when they're half-starved and might die before they reach market. They sat around the table that night, doing math that wouldn't add up no matter how many times they tried. Even if Rowan sold everything, the cattle, his spare saddle, his rifle, they'd still come up short. I could go back to Hackberry, Lila said finally. Try to find work. Even if they won't let me teach, maybe someone needs... No. Rowan's voice was flat. You're not going back there. I can't just sit here while you sell everything you own to pay my legal fees. It's not your legal fees, it's the cost of doing what's right. That's a luxury you can't afford, Lila shot back. None of us can. And I won't watch you lose everything because you're too stubborn to... Too stubborn to what? Let Webb win. Rowan stood up, his chair scraping hard against the floor. That's what happens if you go back. He wins. The system wins. And next time someone decides a woman's worth less than a sack of grain, everyone will remember that it worked out fine for Webb. And if you lose the ranch, what then? Then I lose it. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. They stared at each other across the table, and Lila realized they were both right and both wrong, and neither of them knew how to fix it. Elena cleared her throat. There might be another way. Everyone turned to look at her. The widow Garrett, Elena said. She's looking for a teacher for her grandchildren. I heard her talking about it in town last month. Mrs. Garrett from the big ranch north of here? Javier asked. That's the one. Her daughter moved back from Austin with 3 children. The daughter's husband died and she came home. Mrs. Garrett wants them educated properly, but she won't send them to town school. Why not? Lila asked. Elena's expression was careful. Her daughter married a Mexican man. The children are mixed. Some folks in Hackberry made it clear they weren't welcome. The words hung in the air. Lila felt something twist in her stomach, anger and recognition, and a bone-deep weariness at how people found new ways to be cruel. You think she'd hire me? Lila asked. After everything? I think she cares more about her grandchildren learning than she does about town gossip, Elena said. And I think she's got enough money that she doesn't need to care what anyone else thinks. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. The next morning, Lila rode out with Elena to the Garrett Ranch. It was larger than Rowan's spread. More buildings, more land, more of everything. Even in the drought, it had an air of permanence that Rowan's place lacked. Mrs. Garrett herself answered the door. A tall woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Vasquez, she said, nodding to Elena. What brings you out here? This is Miss Mercer, Elena said. I heard you were looking for a teacher. Mrs. Garrett's gaze shifted to Lila, sharp and assessing. I know who you are. Know what happened in town, too. Lila's stomach sank. Of course she knew. Everyone knew. Then you know I'm... Lila started, but Mrs. Garrett cut her off. I know Clayton Webb is a bastard, and the town council are cowards, she said bluntly. Come in, both of you. They followed her into a sitting room that was mercifully cool, thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. Mrs. Garrett gestured for them to sit. My daughter Rosa is here with her children, she said without preamble. 3 of them, ages 7, 9, and 11. Smart kids. But the school in Hackberry made it clear they weren't wanted, so we pulled them out. Her mouth tightened. I won't have my grandchildren treated like they're less than anyone else's children. I wouldn't either, Lila said quietly. Mrs. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Can you teach them? Yes, ma'am. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, whatever you want them to learn. And you're not going to run off when Webb comes sniffing around with his legal papers? Lila met her eyes. No, ma'am. I'm done running. Something shifted in Mrs. Garrett's expression. Good, because I won't hire someone who'll abandon my grandchildren the first time things get difficult. She named a salary that made Lila's breath catch. $30 a month, plus room and board. It was more than she'd made teaching in Hackberry, more than enough to help pay for the lawyer. I'll take it, Lila said. When do you want me to start? Tomorrow. Rosa will want to meet you first, make sure you're suitable. But if she approves, you can move into the teacher's cottage by the end of the week. They shook hands, and Lila felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't a solution to everything. Webb could still cause trouble. The drought wasn't ending, but it was a start. Rosa Garrett turned out to be a quiet woman in her 30s with her mother's sharp eyes and a wariness that Lila recognized. She'd been hurt, and she'd learned not to trust easily. The children were another story. The oldest, Miguel, was solemn and watchful. The middle child, Carmen, barely stopped talking long enough to breathe. And the youngest, Lucia, clung to her mother's skirts and stared at Lila with huge dark eyes. Can you really teach us? Carmen asked, bouncing on her toes. Mama says you taught all the children in town, even the ones who didn't think they could learn. I can teach you, Lila said, if you're willing to work hard. I'll work hard, Carmen promised. Miguel nodded seriously. Lucia just watched. Rosa asked questions about curriculum, about discipline, about how Lila planned to handle 3 different age levels. Layla answered honestly, and when Rosa finally nodded and said, I think you'll do, Lila felt like she'd passed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. By the end of the week, Lila had moved into the small cottage behind the main house. It was simple but clean, with a real bed and a writing desk and windows that let in light without letting in quite so much heat. After weeks of sleeping in Rowan's spare room, feeling like a charity case, having her own space again felt like breathing for the first time in months. The school itself was a converted storage building that Mrs. Garrett had cleaned out and furnished with benches and a slate board. It wasn't much, but it was more than Lila had expected. She started teaching the next Monday, and within an hour she remembered why she'd loved this work. Miguel was hungry for knowledge, soaking up everything she said and asking questions that showed he was really thinking. Carmen learned through talking, processing out loud until concepts clicked. And Lucia, once she warmed up, turned out to have a gift for numbers that surprised everyone. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like being herself again. But guilt gnawed at her every time she thought about Rowan. She was here, safe and employed, while he was still struggling to keep his ranch alive and pay for a lawyer he couldn't afford. She brought it up one Sunday when she rode back to visit. She'd been coming every week, unwilling to completely sever the connection to the place that had given her sanctuary when she'd had nothing. "I'm making good money," she told Rowan as they sat on his porch. "Let me help pay for the lawyer." "You're helping," he said. "You're building a new life. That's enough." "It's not enough. Not when you're selling your cattle for nothing. And, Lila," he turned to look at her, "this was my choice. I knew what it would cost. Let me make it without you feeling guilty about it." "How am I supposed to do that?" "Same way I stopped feeling guilty about Abilene," he said. "You just decide that what happened isn't your fault, and you focus on what comes next instead of what came before." It sounded simple. It wasn't. But Lila tried. The weeks rolled on, marked by small victories and setbacks. Miguel read his first complete book. Carmen learned to write in cursive. Lucia stopped being shy and started correcting her older siblings when they made mistakes. And the drought continued, relentless and cruel. Rowan sold his cattle for even less than the insulting first offer. 2 more ranches near Hackberry went under completely, the families packing up and heading back east or further west, looking for better fortune. The town itself was starting to look like a ghost town, windows boarded up, streets empty, hope in short supply. Clayton Webb got his court date. The trial was set for late September, almost 2 months away. The lawyer sent another letter saying he needed the second $100 before he'd represent Lila in court. Rowan didn't have it. Even after selling everything he could sell, he was still $40 short. Lila lay awake nights doing math that wouldn't work. Her salary from Mrs. Garrett would cover it eventually, but not in time. She could ask Mrs. Garrett for an advance, but the thought made her stomach turn. She'd already been bought once. She wouldn't go begging for money, no matter how politely it was framed. Then Elena came to her with an idea that was either brilliant or insane. "The Harvest Festival," Elena said. "It's still happening, even with the drought. People need something to hope for, even if it's small." "I don't see how a festival helps us," Lila said. "There's always a fundraiser," Elena explained. "People donate items, we auction them off, the money goes to whoever needs it most. Usually it's the church or the school, but this year," she paused, "this year it could be you. Your legal fund." Lila stared at her. "You want the town that tried to sell me to raise money for my legal defense?" "Not the whole town. Just the people who are ashamed of what happened, and there are more of those than you think." It seemed impossible. But Elena had that determined look she got when she'd made up her mind about something. "Let me talk to people," Elena said. "See if there's support. You don't have to decide anything yet." Lila agreed, mostly because she didn't have a better idea. Elena worked her magic over the next 2 weeks, talking to people in town, at other ranches, anywhere she could find ears willing to listen. And slowly, impossibly, people started responding. Mary Sullivan, whose daughter Lila had taught, donated a quilt. The blacksmith's wife offered a set of iron cooking pots. Even some of the ranchers who'd stood silent during the auction sent word that they'd contribute. Not everyone, of course. Plenty of people wanted nothing to do with it, but enough people felt guilty or ashamed or just believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. The day of the Harvest Festival dawned hot and clear, like every other day in this endless summer. Lila rode into Hackberry with her stomach in knots, unsure if this was courage or stupidity. The festival was smaller than previous years, fewer people, fewer booths, less of everything. But there was music playing, children running around, the smell of food cooking, people trying desperately to pretend things were normal. Lila stayed near the edge at first, not quite ready to wade into the crowd. Then she saw the auction table piled with donated items, and Elena standing beside it with a cash box and a fierce expression. "You came," Elena said, smiling. "I'm here. Not sure I'm staying." "You're staying," Elena said firmly. "People need to see you, need to remember that you're a person, not just a scandal they can gossip about." The auction started at noon. Mayor Hutchins was the auctioneer, and he looked deeply uncomfortable in the role. He called out items and prices in a voice that lacked his usual bluster. People bid, not enthusiastically, but steadily. Mary Sullivan's quilt went for $8, the cooking pots for $6, a saddle blanket for $3, and then Hutchins cleared his throat and said, "This next auction is a bit unusual. The money raised will go to Miss Mercer's legal defense fund. For those of you who don't know, she's facing a court case with Clayton Webb about the validity of that work contract." The crowd went very quiet. "Now, I know there's been talk," Hutchins continued, and he actually looked at Lila when he said it. "But I also know that what happened in this town wasn't right. We let fear and hunger turn us into people we shouldn't be. So this is a chance to do better, to help right a wrong." Someone in the crowd scoffed. Someone else told them to hush. "We've got donations from folks all over the county," Hutchins said, "and we're going to auction them off and give every penny to Miss Mercer. Anyone who doesn't like that is welcome to leave." Nobody left, though Lila noticed Clayton Webb standing at the very back of the crowd, his face dark with fury. The bidding started. A set of spurs went for $5. A bolt of fabric for $7. Item after item, people raised their hands and called out prices, and the cash box slowly filled. Leela watched it all with tears burning behind her eyes. These people had failed her once, but they were trying now, in their imperfect way, to make it right. When the last item sold, Elena counted the money with careful precision. Then she looked up, her eyes bright. $83, she announced. Combined with what Rowan had already scraped together, it was enough. Just barely, but enough. Lila felt her knees go weak. Rowan, who'd been standing behind her the whole time, put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. Clayton Webb pushed through the crowd then, his face twisted with anger. "This is charity," he spat. "Blood money from guilty consciences. It won't save you in court." "Maybe not," Lila said, and her voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd. "But at least I'll get my day in court. At least I'll get to tell a judge what really happened. That's more than you wanted me to have." "You're going to lose," Webb said. "That contract is legal, and no amount of sympathy money changes that." "We'll see." Lila met his eyes. "And when the judge hears how you threatened me, how you gave me a choice between signing or jail, we'll see how legal it really is." Webb's face went red. "You think you're so smart. Think you're better than everyone else, but you're just a—" "Careful," Rowan said, stepping forward. "Real careful." For a moment, Lila thought Webb might throw a punch, but then Sheriff Bradshaw materialized at his elbow. "Maybe you should head home, Clayton," Bradshaw said. "Cool off a bit." Webb shook off his hand. "This isn't over." "No," Lila agreed. "It's not, but it will be. One way or another, it will be." Webb stormed off, and slowly the crowd began to disperse. But several people stopped to talk to Lila, to apologize, to wish her luck, to tell her they were sorry for what had happened. Mary Sullivan hugged her, crying. The blacksmith's wife pressed a basket of food into her hands. Even Mayor Hutchins managed a gruff, "Good luck in court," before hurrying away. It wasn't forgiveness. Lila wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for it. But it was acknowledgement. It was people seeing what they'd done wrong and trying, however clumsily, to do better. As the sun started to set and the festival wound down, Lila found herself sitting on the same platform where she'd been auctioned, the irony not lost on her. Rowan sat down beside her, and they watched the town together in silence. "You scared?" he asked finally. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if we lose? What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if—" "Then we fight it another way. Appeal. Take it to a higher court, whatever we have to do." "You can't keep doing this," Lila said. "You've already lost so much." "Haven't lost anything that matters," Rowan said. "Ranch is just land and buildings. Cattle are just animals. But this?" He gestured between them, between the town and the platform and everything that had happened. "This is about whether we're the kind of people who fight for what's right or the kind who give up when it gets hard." "What if fighting isn't enough?" "Then at least we fought. At least we didn't go quiet." They sat there as the light faded and the first stars appeared, and Lila made a decision. Not about the court case, that was already decided, but about something else. "I want to start a school," she said. "A real one. Not just teaching Mrs. Garrett's grandchildren, though I'll keep doing that, but a school for any child who needs it. Mixed children, poor children, Anyone Hackberry decides isn't good enough. Rowan looked at her. Where? I don't know yet. But somewhere. Maybe here, if I win the case. Maybe somewhere else if I don't. But I'm done letting people like Webb decide who gets to learn and who doesn't. A slow smile crossed Rowan's face. That's a good answer. To what question? To what comes next, he said. That's always the question, isn't it? What comes next? The court date arrived too fast and too slow at the same time. Lila spent the weeks leading up to it working with the lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Thaddeus Crane, who asked her to recount what happened a dozen different ways until her throat was raw from talking. Webb's lawyer will try to discredit you, Crane explained, make you seem unreliable, emotional. He'll say you signed the contract willingly and are now making up stories because you regret it. I'm not making it up, Lila said. I know. But we need to prove it. We need evidence, witnesses, anything that supports your version of events. They had some. Sheriff Bradshaw, reluctantly, had agreed to testify that Webb had seemed overly aggressive about collecting on the contract. Rosa Garrett wrote a letter attesting to Lila's character. Even Mayor Hutchins provided a statement saying the auction had been his idea initially, but that he'd had reservations about the legality. It wasn't much, but it was something. The trial was held in Fort Worth, in a courthouse that seemed impossibly grand after months of drought and desperation. Lila wore her best dress, which wasn't very good, and tried not to shake as she walked into the courtroom. Webb was there with his lawyer, a slick man from Dallas who looked at Lila like she was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. Judge Morrison was an older man with a reputation for fairness, though Lila wasn't sure what fairness meant anymore. The trial lasted 2 days. Webb's lawyer painted Lila as an irresponsible woman who'd taken on debt she couldn't pay and was now trying to weasel out of her obligations. He produced the signed contract, showed the debts she'd accumulated, argued that the auction had been a legitimate way to settle accounts. Then it was Crane's turn. He walked Lila through exactly what happened in Webb's office. The threats, the ultimatum. The way Webb had made it clear she had no real choice. He brought up the whiskey bottle, the inappropriate comments, everything. Did you want to sign that contract? Crane asked. No, Lila said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Did you feel you had any other option? No. In your view, Miss Mercer, were you signing a contract freely, or were you signing it under duress? Under duress, Lila said. Absolutely under duress. Webb's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. The testimony continued. When they broke for the day, Crane seemed cautiously optimistic. You did well. Came across as credible, sympathetic. But will we win? Lila asked. I don't know, he admitted. Judge Morrison is fair, but he's also a stickler for the law. If he decides the contract is technically legal despite the duress, we could lose. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She lay in the boarding house bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to imagine what would happen if they lost. Would she have to go back to Webb? Would he force her to work off the debt? Would she end up right back where she started, only worse because now everyone would know she'd fought and lost? The second day was worse. Webb took the stand and lied smoothly, claiming Lila had signed willingly and was making up stories out of spite. His lawyer hammered at inconsistencies in the timeline, questioned why Lila hadn't reported the threats at the time, suggested she was trying to manipulate sympathy. But then Crane did something unexpected. He called Rosa Garrett to the stand. Mrs. Garrett, you've employed Miss Mercer as a teacher for your children, correct? Yes. And has she given you any reason to doubt her honesty or integrity? None whatsoever. Has she ever tried to manipulate you or gain sympathy through false claims? Never. She's been nothing but professional and honest. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The judge took a full day to deliberate. Lila spent that day walking the streets of Fort Worth, trying to distract herself, trying not to think about what came next. When they returned to court, Judge Morrison looked tired. He reviewed the case briefly, then said, This court finds that while the contract itself was technically legal, it was signed under duress. Mr. Webb's threats of arrest constituted coercion, which invalidates Miss Mercer's consent. The contract is therefore void. Lila's knees buckled. Rowan caught her arm, steadying her. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering Mr. Webb to return the $50 paid by Mr. Hale. As that payment was made toward a contract this court has now deemed invalid. Webb's face went purple. His lawyer started to object, but the judge cut him off. "This case is closed. Miss Mercer, you're free to go." Free. The word echoed in Lila's head like a bell. Free. They walked out of the courthouse into blazing sunshine, and Lila felt something break open in her chest. Not just relief, something bigger, something like hope. "We won," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Yeah," Rowan said, and he was smiling, really smiling, not the careful half-smile she'd gotten used to. "We did." That night, they celebrated in a small restaurant in Fort Worth. Lila, Rowan, Crane, and Elena and Javier, who'd made the trip to support them. It was nothing fancy, just decent food and weak beer and the bone-deep satisfaction of a battle won. "What happens now?" Crane asked. "You going back to Hackberry?" "Eventually," Lila said. "But not to teach. Not there. I'm going to start my own school, somewhere that doesn't care what happened to me or who my students are." "That's ambitious," Crane said. "That's necessary," Lila corrected. They rode back to the ranch the next day, and Lila felt different somehow. Lighter, like she'd been carrying something heavy for so long she'd forgotten it was there, and now it was finally gone. Mrs. Garrett was delighted by the news and immediately offered Lila a permanent position with a raise. The children celebrated by insisting on a special lesson about the American legal system, which turned into Carmen acting out the entire trial with excessive dramatic flair. And Rowan got his ranch back, or at least the possibility of it. The $50 from Webb, plus what was left of the fundraiser money, gave him enough breathing room to make it through another month or two. It wasn't enough to save everything. The drought was still killing the land, but it was enough to hope. One evening, a week after the trial, Lila rode back to Rowan's place and found him on the porch, the same spot where they'd had so many conversations. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous habit." She smiled. "I want to build the school here, on your land, if you'll let me." Rowan looked up, surprised. "Here? You've got the space. It's far enough from Hackberry that people who don't want to deal with that town won't have to. And," she paused, "and I trust you. I trust this place. It feels right." "What about Mrs. Garrett's children?" "I'll keep teaching them too. But I want something bigger, something that says what happened to me won't define what happens next." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's an old barn on the east section. Hasn't been used in years. We could fix it up, turn it into a schoolhouse." "We?" Lila asked. "Well, you can't build it yourself," Rowan said. "And Javier's got carpentry skills. Elena knows everyone in 3 counties. She could help spread the word." "And you?" Lila asked. "What would you do?" Rowan met her eyes. "Whatever you need, same as always." Something passed between them then, an understanding deeper than words. They'd been through hell together, had fought battles neither of them should have had to fight. And somewhere in all of that, they'd become something neither of them quite had words for yet. "Okay," Lila said, "let's build a school." The barn was worse than Lila had imagined. Half the roof was missing, the walls leaned at angles that defied reason, and something had definitely died in the back corner at some point in the recent past. She stood in the doorway with Rowan and Javier, surveying the wreckage, and tried to see it as anything other than a complete disaster. "It's got good bones," Javier said, which Lila suspected was what people said when there was nothing else positive to offer. "It's got some bones," Rowan corrected. "Whether they're good is debatable." Lila walked inside, her boots crunching on debris. Sunlight poured through the gaps in the roof, creating patterns on the dirt floor. Birds had nested in the rafters. The whole place smelled like rot and neglect. "How much would it cost to fix?" she asked. "More than we've got," Rowan said honestly. "Lumber alone would run us close to $100, and that's if we can find anyone willing to sell at a reasonable price. So we need to raise money again, or we need to get creative." Javier walked over to one of the walls, testing its stability. "Some of this wood is still good. We could salvage what we can, trade labor for materials, maybe ask around to see if anyone has spare lumber they're not using." It sounded impossible, but then again, winning the court case had seemed impossible too. "All right," Lila said. "Where do we start?" They started by clearing out the debris. It took 3 full days of backbreaking work, hauling out rotted wood, clearing away years of accumulated dirt and bird droppings, removing the remains of whatever animal had chosen the barn as its final resting place. Elena helped when she could, and Mrs. Garrett sent Miguel over a few afternoons to lend a hand. Even Rosa showed up one day with Carmen and Lucia, and the children made a game of sorting salvageable wood from kindling. "Why are you doing this?" Carmen asked Lila as they worked. "Wouldn't it be easier to just teach at a regular school?" "Easier, yes," Lila said, tossing another piece of rotted wood onto the discard pile. "But this isn't about easy. This is about making sure every child who wants to learn has a place to do it, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Carmen thought about that. "Because the town school didn't want us?" "Because the town school was wrong," Lila said firmly, "and someone needed to say so." By the end of the first week, they had a clean space and a growing pile of salvageable materials. Javier had sketched out plans for the repairs, what needed to be replaced, what could be reinforced, how to make the most of what they had. But they still needed lumber, and nails, and roofing materials, and money they didn't have. Lila brought it up one evening as she, Rowan, Elena, and Javier sat on the porch watching the sun set over the drought-ravaged land. "We could ask people to donate," Elena suggested, "like we did for the legal fund." "We already asked once," Lila said. "I don't want to go begging again." "It's not begging if you're offering something in return," Rowan said thoughtfully. "Like what?" "Labor, skills, whatever people need that we can provide." He looked at Javier. "You're good with carpentry and leatherwork. I can break horses, fix equipment. Elena can cook and preserve food better than anyone I know." "And you can teach," Elena added, looking at Lila. Lila blinked. "I'm already teaching. Mrs. Garrett's grandchildren, yes. But what about adults? People who never learned to read, or who want to learn to cipher properly, or who need help with contracts and legal documents so they don't get cheated." It was an interesting idea. Lila had always thought of teaching as something you did with children, but plenty of adults in the area couldn't read, or could barely read. And after what had happened to her, she knew firsthand how dangerous it was to be unable to understand the documents you were signing. "We could trade lessons for materials," she said slowly. "Teach someone to read in exchange for lumber. Help them understand their accounts in exchange for nails." "Exactly," Elena said. "People need what you know. You need what they have. It's fair exchange." They spent the next few days spreading the word. Elena talked to people at the general store and the church. Javier mentioned it to other ranch hands when they met in town. Lila brought it up with the parents of her students at the Garrett Ranch. The response was mixed. Some people were interested. Others were suspicious, wondering what Lila was really after. A few were openly hostile, still loyal to Clayton Webb, or still believing that what had happened to Lila had been somehow her own fault. But enough people responded positively that they managed to put together a list of potential trades. A rancher named Morrison would provide lumber in exchange for teaching his wife to read. She'd been functionally illiterate her whole life and was ashamed of it. The blacksmith would donate nails if Lila would help his son with his arithmetic. A widow with 3 grown sons would contribute labor if someone would teach her to understand the numbers in her late husband's account books. It wasn't everything they needed, but it was a start. Lila began teaching in the evenings and on weekends. Mrs. Morrison was her first adult student, a shy woman in her 40s who held a pencil like it might bite her and who nearly cried the first time she successfully wrote her own name. "I never thought I could do this," Mrs. Morrison said, staring at the letters on the slate. "Always thought I was just too stupid." "You're not stupid," Lila said firmly. "You just never had someone teach you properly. There's a difference." Teaching adults was different from teaching children. They brought more shame to their learning, more fear of failure. But they also brought focus and determination that children often lacked. Mrs. Morrison practiced her letters every night, showing up to each lesson with hands stained with ink from copying passages Lila had given her. The blacksmith's son was another story. 12 years old and convinced that mathematics was a conspiracy designed to make him miserable. Lila spent hours with him, finding ways to make the concepts concrete, using horseshoes to teach multiplication, measuring iron to demonstrate fractions. "Why do I need to know this?" he complained one afternoon. "Because someone's going to try to cheat you someday," Lila said bluntly. "And if you can't do the math yourself, you won't know until it's too late." He thought about that. "Like what happened to you?" Lila hadn't expected the question, but she didn't shy away from it. "Exactly like what happened to me. I signed a contract without fully understanding the terms. I trusted the wrong person, and it almost destroyed my life." She met his eyes. Don't be like me. Learn the numbers. Know what you're signing. After that, his attitude changed. He still struggled, but he worked harder. As the lessons continued and materials started arriving, work on the barn progressed. Rowan and Javier spent every spare moment on repairs, replacing rotted beams, patching the roof, reinforcing walls. It was slow, frustrating work made worse by the continuing drought, because the drought wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. The few remaining wells in the area were running dry. Cattle were dying faster than they could be sold. More families were packing up and leaving every week. "How much longer can we hold out?" Lila asked Rowan one night. They were sitting on the barn floor taking a break from work. Sweat dripped down both their faces despite the evening hour. "Honestly, I don't know." Rowan took a long drink from his canteen. "Another month, maybe 2. After that," he didn't finish. "After that, we're in the same position everyone else is in." "Yeah." Lila looked around the half-finished barn. "Maybe this is crazy. Maybe we should be focusing on survival instead of building a school nobody might even use." "You don't believe that." "I don't know what I believe anymore." She was tired, bone-tired, in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Sometimes I think we're just throwing good effort after bad, fighting for something that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You remember what you told the blacksmith's kid about learning so nobody can cheat you?" "Yeah, that matters. That matters more than rain or drought or whether we make it through next month. Because if we give up on teaching people to stand up for themselves, we're saying what happened to you was acceptable, that it's fine for people like Webb to win. Webb already lost. The court ruled in your favor, but Webb's still in Hackberry, still running his store, still cheating people who don't know better. He lost a battle, but he hasn't lost the war." Rowan looked at her. "This school? It's how we win the war, not just for you, for everyone who comes after." Lila wanted to argue, wanted to point out that they were 2 people working on a broken barn in the middle of a drought. How was that winning anything? But she knew he was right. She'd known it since the moment she'd decided to build the school. This wasn't about her anymore. It was bigger than her. "All right," she said finally. "We keep going." "Damn right we do." Progress was slow but steady. By the end of October, they had a roof that didn't leak, walls that stood straight, and a floor that was packed dirt but at least level. It wasn't beautiful, but it was functional. And then, on the 1st of November, something happened that nobody expected. It rained. Not much, just a brief afternoon shower that lasted maybe 20 minutes. But it was rain, real rain, the first substantial precipitation in almost a year. Lila was teaching Carmen and Lucia when the first drops hit the barn's new roof. Both children looked up, eyes wide. "Is that—" Carmen started. "Rain," Lila finished, and she was already moving toward the door. She stepped outside into the drizzle and just stood there, face turned up to the sky. The drops were warm and sparse, but they were real. Around her, she could hear shouts of joy and disbelief as others noticed. Rowan came running from the house, and when he saw her standing there, he started laughing, actually laughing, deep and genuine in a way she'd never heard from him. "It's raining," she said stupidly. "I can see that." They stood together in the sparse drizzle, and Lila felt something shift in her chest. Hope. Actual hope. Not the desperate clinging to straws kind she'd been surviving on, but real optimism that maybe things could get better. The rain didn't last long, and it wasn't enough to break the drought, but it was something. It was proof that the sky still remembered how to rain, that the land could still be saved. Over the next few weeks, there were more scattered showers. Never much, but enough to green up some of the grass, to refill a few of the wells. Enough to make people believe that next year might be different, and the school kept growing. Word spread, and more families started expressing interest. Some wanted their children to attend. Others, adults who'd never had the chance to learn, wanted lessons for themselves. By mid-November, Lila had a list of 15 potential students. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make the school feel real. They set an opening date for January, after the holidays. That gave them time to finish the last of the repairs, to build proper benches, to acquire books and slates and all the other supplies the school needed. It also gave Lila time to panic. "What if nobody shows up?" she asked Elena one evening. They were making tortillas together, a ritual that had become comforting in its regularity. "People will show up," Elena said calmly. What if I'm a terrible teacher? What if I can't handle that many students at once? What if... Lila, Elena's hand stilled on the dough. You're scared because this matters to you. That's good. That means you'll work hard to make it good. Or it means I'll fail spectacularly. Maybe. But you won't fail because you didn't try. You won't fail because you gave up. Elena met her eyes. You'll fail, if you fail, because you cared too much and tried too hard. And that's the kind of failure you can live with. Lila wasn't sure she agreed, but she appreciated the sentiment. The relationship between her and Rowan had shifted too, though neither of them quite acknowledged it. They worked together on the school, sat together on the porch most evenings, talked about everything and nothing. But there was something else there now, something neither of them had words for yet. It showed in small ways. The way Rowan's hand would linger on her shoulder when he helped her down from a horse. The way Lila caught herself watching him work, admiring the efficiency of his movements. The way their conversations lasted later into the night, neither of them wanting to be the first to say goodnight. Elena noticed, of course. She didn't comment directly, but Lila caught the knowing looks, the small smiles. "You're happy here," Elena said one day. It wasn't quite a question. "I am," Lila admitted, which is strange considering everything. Why is it strange? You have work you care about, people who care about you, a home. Is that what this is? Lila looked around the kitchen of Rowan's house, where she'd been spending more and more time. Home? What else would you call it? Lila didn't have an answer for that. December brought cooler weather and more intermittent rain. Not enough to declare the drought over, but enough to give the land a fighting chance. Green shoots started appearing in places that had been dead brown for months. A few ranchers who'd been on the verge of leaving decided to stay another season. The school was nearly finished. They'd managed to acquire enough benches for 20 students, a proper slate board for the front wall, and a small collection of books. Some donated, some purchased with money Lila had saved from her teaching wages. It looked like a real school. It looked like hope built into wood and nails. They decided to have a small gathering to celebrate the completion of the building. Nothing fancy, just an open house so people could see what they'd built and meet Lila properly. "You sure about this?" Rowan asked the night before. "You don't have to prove anything to these people." "I know," Lila said, "but I want them to see what we built. I want them to understand that this is for everyone, not just the acceptable children. Everyone." The gathering was modest. Maybe 30 people showed up, which was more than Lila had expected. Mrs. Garrett came with Rosa and the children. Several of Lila's adult students attended. Even a few families from Hackberry made the trip, though they looked uncomfortable about it. Clayton Webb did not attend, which was a relief. Lila gave a short speech, keeping it simple. This school exists because people believed education should be available to everyone, rich or poor, young or old, whatever your background. If you want to learn, you're welcome here. That's the only requirement. Afterward, people toured the building. Mrs. Morrison, who could now read simple passages, pointed out the books to her husband with obvious pride. The blacksmith's son demonstrated his improved arithmetic to anyone who would listen. Carmen gave an enthusiastic and highly exaggerated tour to several bemused ranchers. And Lila stood to the side, watching it all, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Real, uncomplicated pride in something she'd built from nothing. "You did good," Rowan said quietly, appearing at her elbow. "We did good," she corrected. He smiled. "Yeah, we did." As the sun set and people started heading home, Lila found herself alone in the school, straightening benches that didn't need straightening, running her hands over the slate board. This was hers. Not in the legal sense, it was on Rowan's land, built with community effort. But in every way that mattered, this was hers. Her dream, her purpose, her chance to prove that what happened on that platform in Hackberry didn't get to define her. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Rowan in the doorway. "Thought I'd find you here," he said. "Just taking it in." She gestured around the room. 6 months ago, I was standing on a platform being sold for grain. Now I'm standing in my own school. It doesn't seem real. "It's real." Rowan walked over to stand beside her. "You made it real." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Lila said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you really do all this? The truth, not the story about Abilene." Rowan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. The Abilene thing is true. That's part of it. But, he paused. When I saw you on that platform, I saw someone who was scared but trying not to show it. Someone who was angry but holding it in. Someone who deserved better than what was happening to her. Lots of people deserve better than what happens to them, Lila said quietly. Yeah, but you were right there, right in front of me, and I had the chance to do something about it. He looked at her. I'd spent 5 years regretting not acting in Abilene. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life regretting not acting in Hackberry. So it was about your guilt. At first, maybe, but not now. His gaze held hers. Now it's about you, about who you are and what you're building, about the fact that you took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into something good. Lila's breath caught. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the small scar above his eyebrow. Rowan, she started, not sure what she was going to say. He waited, patient as always. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Whatever this is, I don't know if I'm ready for anything beyond what we already have. That's all right, he said. We don't have to figure it out tonight, or tomorrow, or any specific time. We just have to keep being honest with each other. It was such a Rowan answer, practical and patient, and giving her exactly the space she needed. Okay, she said. Honest. I can do honest. She took a breath. Honestly, I care about you, more than I probably should. More than is smart, considering. Considering what? Considering I'm still figuring out who I am after everything. Considering you saved me and there's probably some psychological explanation for why I've developed feelings that isn't actually real feelings. Lila. His hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle and warm. Stop overthinking. I'm good at overthinking. I know. But sometimes, he leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Sometimes you just have to feel. The kiss was soft and careful, a question more than a statement. Lila answered it by leaning into him, her hands finding his shoulders, and for a moment everything else fell away. When they finally pulled apart, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. That honest enough for you? Lila laughed, surprising herself. Yeah, that's pretty honest. They stood there in the school, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky. And Lila thought about how strange life was. How 6 months could take you from the worst moment of your existence to standing in your own school, being kissed by a good man who'd seen you at your lowest and chosen to stay anyway. What happens now? She asked. Same thing that always happens, Rowan said. We figure out the next thing. Together, if you want. Together sounds good. Christmas came quietly. Lila spent it at Rowan's ranch with him, Elena, and Javier. It was simple, a decent meal, small gifts, nothing extravagant. But it felt warm and right in a way Lila's previous Christmases never had. Elena gave her a shawl she'd knitted. Javier presented her with a hand-carved desk organizer for her teaching supplies. And Rowan gave her a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. For your thoughts, he said, or lesson plans, or whatever you want to fill it with. Lila ran her fingers over the smooth leather. It's perfect. Thank you. She'd gotten him a new hat. His old one was so battered it was barely holding together. He put it on immediately and refused to take it off the rest of the day, even though Elena teased him mercilessly. It was a good day. A normal day. The kind of day Lila had stopped believing she could have. The school opened in early January with 11 students on the first day. Not as many as Lila had hoped, but more than she'd feared. They ranged in age from 6 to 53, the latter being a ranch hand who decided he was tired of having other people read his mail for him. Lila divided them into rough groups by ability rather than age. The youngest children worked on basic letters and sounds. The middle group focused on reading comprehension and arithmetic. The advanced students, including Miguel Garrett, tackled history and geography. It was chaos at first. Trying to teach 3 different levels at once while also managing behavior and keeping everyone engaged was like trying to juggle while riding a horse. But Lila found her rhythm eventually, developed systems that worked, learned to anticipate problems before they erupted, and slowly, her students learned. The ranch hand wrote his first letter home to his mother in Mexico, tears streaming down his weathered face as he sounded out the words. The youngest children started recognizing words in the world around them, pointing excitedly at signs and labels. Miguel finished reading an entire book about ancient Rome and immediately asked for more. It wasn't easy. Some days were frustrating beyond belief. Some students struggled despite her best efforts. Some parents questioned her methods or complained that their children weren't learning fast enough. But it was worth it. Every small victory, every moment of understanding that dawned on a student's face, every time someone read a passage correctly or solved a problem they'd been stuck on, it was all worth it. One afternoon in late February, Lila looked up from helping a student to find Sheriff Bradshaw standing in the doorway of the school. Her stomach dropped. Had Webb found some new legal angle? Was there another problem? But Bradshaw looked uncomfortable rather than official. "Miss Mercer, got a moment?" Lila assigned her student some independent work and stepped outside with him. "What is this about, Sheriff?" "Just wanted to check on you, see how you're doing." He shifted his weight. "Heard you got this school up and running." "I do. And we're doing fine, so if that's all—" "It's not all," he sighed. "Look, I owe you an apology for what happened with the auction and for taking so long to stand up to Webb. I should have done it sooner, should have stopped it before it got as far as it did." Lila studied him. He looked genuinely remorseful, but she wasn't sure she cared. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because my daughter's 7 years old, and she's asking why she can't come to your school instead of the one in town. And I realized I couldn't give her a good answer." He met Lila's eyes. "I'd like her to attend here, if you'll have her. And I'd like to pay you fair wages for it. Not charity, just payment for services rendered." It was the last thing Lila had expected. "Does your wife know you're here?" "It was her idea. She's the one who heard about the school from Mrs. Morrison. Said if the Morrisons trust you, she does too." Lila thought about saying no, about turning him away and making him feel the rejection she'd felt. But then she thought about what she'd told everyone at the opening. This school was for everyone who wanted to learn, and punishing a child for her father's mistakes wasn't the kind of teacher she wanted to be. "Bring her by tomorrow," Lila said. "We'll see if it's a good fit." Bradshaw's face flooded with relief. "Thank you. Really. Thank you." After he left, Lila stood outside the school for a moment, collecting herself. The world was strange and complicated. People were capable of terrible things and genuine remorse, sometimes in the same breath. All you could do was keep moving forward, keep trying, keep hoping that more people would choose to do better than they had before. That evening, she told Rowan about Bradshaw's visit. "You think he means it?" Rowan asked. "The apology?" "I think he feels guilty. Whether that's the same as meaning it, I don't know." Lila leaned against the porch railing. "But his daughter deserves a chance to learn, and I won't punish her for what her father did or didn't do." "You're a better person than me," Rowan said. "I'd have told him where he could shove his apology." "I thought about it, but then I remembered that this school exists because people gave me chances I didn't think I deserved. The fundraiser, the trial, all of it. People who could have stayed silent chose to help instead." She looked at him. "How can I deny someone else that same chance?" Rowan pulled her close, and she leaned into him, grateful for the solid warmth of him. "You're going to change things here," he said quietly. "Already have, really. This place is different because of you." "We're different because of each other," Lila corrected. The next few months were a blur of teaching and learning and slowly building a life that felt sustainable. More students enrolled. The school grew to 18, then 20, then 23. Lila had to expand her hours and bring in help. Rosa Garrett volunteered to teach music and Spanish twice a week, and one of Lila's adult students who'd mastered basic arithmetic offered to help with the younger children. The drought officially broke in April with 3 days of steady rain that turned the world green almost overnight. It was like watching a resurrection, grass sprouting, wildflowers blooming, creeks running again for the first time in over a year. Rowan's ranch started recovering, not quickly, but steadily. He bought a few head of cattle from a neighboring rancher who was downsizing, started rebuilding his herd. The land wasn't healed yet, but it was healing, and Lila and Rowan kept figuring out what they were to each other. It wasn't simple or straightforward. They both carried scars, his from years of isolation and hers from trauma that didn't just disappear because things got better. But they were learning to trust, to be vulnerable, to believe that good things could last. One evening in May, They sat on the porch of what Lila had started thinking of as their house. She'd gradually moved most of her belongings from the teacher's cottage at the Garrett Ranch to Rowan's place, though neither of them had explicitly discussed it. "I've been thinking," Rowan said. "Dangerous habit," Lila teased, echoing his words from months ago. He smiled. "I want to make this official. The school, I mean. Transfer part of the land to you legally so you own it outright." Lila sat up straighter. "Rowan, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He took her hand. "You built something important here, something that should last beyond me, beyond us, and I want to make sure it's protected, that nobody can take it away from you." "Nobody can take it away?" Lila said. The court ruled on one case with one man, but laws change, droughts come back, people get desperate again. His grip tightened slightly. "I want you to have something that's yours, legally, permanently yours, no matter what happens." Lila felt tears prick her eyes. "This is about more than the school, isn't it?" "Yeah, it's about you never having to stand on a platform again, never having to worry that someone can take away what you've built." He brought her hand to his lips. "It's about making sure you're safe. Always." She kissed him then, hard and grateful and full of things she didn't have words for yet. They drew up the papers the following week. 20 acres of Rowan's land, including the school building and the teacher's cottage, transferred to Lila Mercer in perpetuity. It wasn't a fortune, but it was security. It was permanent in a way nothing in Lila's life had ever been. The day they signed the deed, Lila stood on her land, and felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. This was hers. And nobody could ever take it away. Summer arrived with a vengeance, but this time the heat brought thunderstorms instead of drought. The land remembered how to drink, and everything that had looked dead came back fighting for life. Lila's school had 27 students now, which meant she was teaching in 2 shifts, younger children in the morning, older students and adults in the afternoon and evening. It was exhausting work, but the kind of exhaustion that felt earned. One afternoon in late June, she was helping a 10-year-old girl sound out words when she noticed a rider approaching the school. Her stomach tensed automatically. Old instincts died hard, but relaxed when she recognized Mrs. Garrett. The older woman dismounted with the stiffness of someone whose body didn't bend the way it used to. She waited patiently while Lila finished the lesson and dismissed her students for a break. "Mrs. Garrett," Lila said, walking over. "Is something wrong? The children?" "The children are fine. Rosa's fine. Everyone's fine." Mrs. Garrett smiled slightly. "I'm here on different business. Can we talk?" They sat on the bench outside the school, and Mrs. Garrett got straight to it. "I've been thinking about expanding your arrangement," she said. "Right now you teach my grandchildren a few hours a week while running this school. I'd like to formalize it. Pay you a proper salary to be their primary teacher. Not instead of this school, but in addition to it. With enough money that you could hire another teacher to help you here." Lila blinked. "That's generous, but I'm not sure I could manage both." "You'd have help. I'd pay for an assistant teacher here, plus provide housing for them. And I'd handle the bureaucratic nonsense, filing with the county, making sure everything's legal and proper." Mrs. Garrett's eyes were sharp. "I want my grandchildren to have the best education possible. You're the best teacher in 3 counties. This is me being selfish, not generous." "I don't know what to say." "Say yes. Or say you'll think about it. But don't say no just because you think you don't deserve good things." Mrs. Garrett's voice softened slightly. "I've watched you build this school from nothing. I've seen you teach children other people gave up on. You're doing important work, Miss Mercer. Let me help you do more of it." Lila thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, I'll do it." The extra income meant she could hire Thomas Brennan, a young man from Fort Worth who'd recently finished normal school and was looking for teaching experience. He was green and nervous, but eager and kind, exactly the kind of person Lila could work with. With Thomas handling the morning students, Lila could focus on the more advanced classes and her adult learners. The school was becoming something real, something permanent, not just her personal project, but an actual institution. But success brought new complications. Clayton Webb had been quiet since the trial, but he hadn't disappeared. He still ran his store in Hackberry, still had influence with certain people, and he was watching the school's growth with visible resentment. The first sign of trouble came in August when one of Lila's students, a 14-year-old boy named Peter, showed up with bruises on his face. "What happened?" Lila asked, pulling him aside. Peter wouldn't meet her eyes. "Nothing. I fell." "Peter," he sighed. "Some boys from town, they said I was wasting my time here. That you're just teaching us lies and making trouble. That their fathers said you're—" He stopped, jaw tight. "Said I'm what?" "Not a proper teacher. That you're just a woman who couldn't keep her own affairs in order, so why should anyone listen to you?" Lila felt the familiar burn of shame and anger mixing in her chest. She'd thought she was past this, thought she'd proven herself. But some people would never let her move beyond that platform. "What do you think?" she asked Peter quietly. He looked up, surprised. "Ma'am? Do you think I'm wasting your time, teaching you lies?" "No, ma'am. You taught me to read, to cipher, to think about things different." His voice was fierce despite the bruises. "I don't care what those boys say, or their fathers. You're the best teacher I've ever had." Lila squeezed his shoulder. "Thank you. Now let's get some ice on that eye." But Peter wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, other students reported similar incidents. Children being harassed, parents being pressured to withdraw their kids from the school, whispers that Lila was corrupting the youth, teaching them to be disrespectful, filling their heads with ideas above their station. Webb's fingerprints were all over it, even if he wasn't doing the dirty work himself. "We should file a complaint," Rowan said when Lila told him about it. "Get the sheriff involved." "Bradshaw's already involved. His daughter goes here, remember? But what's he going to do? Arrest people for gossip?" Lila shook her head. "We can't fight this with law. We have to fight it with results." "What kind of results?" "The kind that prove those people wrong." She doubled down on her teaching, pushed her students harder, made sure they were learning not just to read and write, but to think critically, to question, to understand the world and their place in it. And in September, she did something that made Webb's supporters lose their minds. She entered 6 of her students in the county academic competition. The competition was an annual event where schools from across the county sent their best students to compete in mathematics, spelling, composition, and general knowledge. Hackberry School usually dominated, their well-funded program producing polished students who knew their material cold. Lila's students were learning in a converted barn with secondhand books, but they were hungry in a way the town children weren't. They had something to prove. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked when she told him her plan. "Those Hackberry kids have been preparing all year." "So have ours. They just didn't know they were preparing." Lila looked at the list of students she'd chosen: Miguel Garrett, Peter, Carmen, and 3 others who'd shown exceptional aptitude. "We can do this." The competition was held in Fort Worth in early October. Lila brought her 6 students, along with Rowan and Elena, for support. Thomas stayed behind to manage the school. When they arrived at the competition hall, the whispers started immediately. Lila heard fragments. "That's her. The one from the auction. Can't believe she has the nerve." But she kept her head high and her students focused. The Hackberry contingent was led by a prissy woman named Mrs. Holloway, who'd been teaching there for 20 years. She looked at Lila's students with barely concealed disdain. "How quaint," Mrs. Holloway said when she saw them. "I didn't realize your little endeavor was entering the competition." "We're a registered school with the county," Lila said evenly. "We have every right to be here." Of course. I just meant, well, it's brave of you to try, given the circumstances." Lila knew exactly what circumstances she meant. The circumstances of Lila's public humiliation, the circumstances of her questionable character, the circumstances that, in Mrs. Holloway's view, made Lila unfit to teach anyone anything. "My students are well prepared," Lila said. "That's the only circumstance that matters." The competition started with mathematics. Miguel went up against a boy from Hackberry who looked supremely confident. The problems were difficult, multi-step calculations that required not just memorization, but actual understanding. Miguel finished first, and when the judges checked his work, every answer was correct. The Hackberry boy had made 3 mistakes. Spelling was next, and Carmen faced off against a girl who'd apparently won the County Bee 2 years running. They went back and forth for 17 rounds before the Hackberry girl finally misspelled garrulous. Carmen, who'd been studying with a dictionary every night for months, nailed it on the first try. By lunchtime, Lila's students had won 3 events outright and placed second in 2 others. The Hackberry contingent was looking rattled. Mrs. Holloway cornered Lila during the break. What exactly are you teaching those children? Reading, writing, arithmetic, same as everyone else. It's more than that. They're too confident, too outspoken. You're filling their heads with ideas. About thinking for themselves? Lila interrupted. About believing they're just as capable as anyone else? Yes, I am. Is that a problem? Mrs. Holloway's face flushed. You're going to ruin them. Make them unsuitable for their proper places in society. Their proper places, Lila repeated slowly. You mean poor, uneducated, invisible? She stepped closer. My students don't have proper places. They have potential, and I'm teaching them to reach it. The afternoon session was composition and general knowledge. Peter wrote an essay about the drought that was so vivid and honest it brought tears to one of the judge's eyes. Another of Lila's students correctly answered questions about history and geography that stumped the competition. When the final scores were tallied, Lila's little school from the converted barn had won 4 categories and placed in all 6. They didn't win overall. Hackberry still had the numbers and resources to edge them out, but they'd made a statement that couldn't be ignored. These children could compete with anyone. These children were just as smart, just as capable, just as worthy as the kids from the fancy town school. And Lila had taught them. On the ride home, her students were giddy with victory. Miguel kept looking at his mathematics medal like it might disappear. Carmen practiced her spelling bee winning word over and over. Even Rowan, normally reserved, couldn't stop smiling. You did it, he said to Lila quietly. You proved them all wrong. We did it, she corrected. Those kids did it. I just gave them the chance. But she knew what he meant. She'd proven that she wasn't just some fallen woman running a charity project. She was a real teacher building a real school that produced real results. The victory had consequences, of course. Some of them good. Enrollment applications increased. More families wanted their children to attend. But some were predictably bad. Clayton Webb filed a formal complaint with the county school board, claiming Lila's school didn't meet proper standards and should be shut down. It was harassment, pure and simple, but it required a formal response. Mrs. Garrett, bless her, went to war. She contacted lawyers, provided documentation of the school's curriculum and funding, and personally vouched for Lila's credentials. The school board ultimately dismissed Webb's complaint, but not before it cost Lila a week of sleep and a month of stress. Why won't he just let it go? Lila asked Rowan one night. They were lying in bed, her head on his chest, his fingers running absently through her hair. Because you won, Rowan said simply. You stood up to him and you won. And now every time someone looks at your school, they remember that he lost. His ego can't handle it. So he's going to harass me forever? Probably until he finds a new target or gets bored. Rowan kissed the top of her head. But you're not alone in fighting him. You've got me, Elena, Javier, Mrs. Garrett, half the county. He's the one who's alone. It was true. The community that had failed Lila so spectacularly 2 years ago had slowly rebuilt itself into something better. Not perfect. There were still people who thought she was scandalous, still families who wouldn't send their children to her school. But enough people believed in what she was doing that Webb's opinion didn't matter as much as it once had. Winter came again, but this time with normal amounts of rain and snow. The land had recovered from the drought, though the scars remained. Dead trees, eroded soil, memories of cattle carcasses rotting in the sun. Lila's school kept growing. By January, she had 32 students and had to expand the building. Rowan and Javier built an addition with help from several families whose children attended. It wasn't fancy, but it doubled the space. And in February, something happened that Lila hadn't expected. Clayton Webb's store went bankrupt. The details were murky, but apparently he'd been cooking his books for years, cheating suppliers and customers alike. When a creditor from Dallas finally audited his accounts, the whole rotten structure came tumbling down. Webb lost everything: the store, his house, his reputation. He left Hackberry in the middle of the night, reportedly headed for California, though nobody knew for sure. Lila felt a complicated mix of emotions when Elena brought her the news. Relief, certainly, but also a strange kind of sadness. She'd built so much of her new life in opposition to Webb, in proving him wrong. What did it mean that he was just gone? It means you won, Elena said, reading her expression. Not just the trial, everything. He tried to destroy you, and instead you built something he could never touch. He destroyed himself, Lila corrected. I just survived him. Surviving is winning, mija. That's the lesson you should teach. That night, Lila sat down with the journal Rowan had given her for Christmas over a year ago. She'd filled maybe a quarter of it with lesson plans and notes. The rest remained blank. She started writing. Not lesson plans this time, but her own story. What had happened on that platform? The fear and shame and rage. The long climb back to something resembling dignity. The people who'd helped and the ones who'd hurt her. She wrote for hours, filling page after page with everything she'd been carrying. And when she finally set down the pen, something felt different. Lighter. She'd told her story, not the way other people told it, not as gossip or scandal or cautionary tale, but as the truth, messy and painful and ultimately survivable. She showed it to Rowan the next morning. You don't have to read it if you don't want, she said. It's just, I needed to write it down, make sense of it all. He read it carefully, and when he finished, his eyes were wet. This is important, he said. This is something people need to hear. I don't know about that. I do. He took her hands. You think you're the only woman who's been in an impossible situation? Who's been backed into a corner and forced to make terrible choices? This story, your story, it shows that you can survive, that you can fight back, that you can win. I don't want to be some symbol, Lila protested. I'm just a teacher who got lucky. You're not a symbol. You're a person. But you're a person who did something remarkable. He squeezed her hands. Let people learn from it, the way your students learn from you. She thought about it for a long time. Then she made copies of what she'd written and gave them to some of her adult students, women mostly, who'd faced their own impossible situations. Women who'd been told they were worthless, who'd been pushed down and expected to stay there. The response was overwhelming. They saw themselves in her story. They found hope in her survival. And slowly, Lila started to understand what Rowan had meant. She wasn't just teaching reading and writing and arithmetic. She was teaching something bigger, that your worst moment doesn't define you, that you can remake yourself, that surviving is worth something. Spring came early that year, and with it, a surprise. Rowan proposed. Not in some grand romantic gesture. That wasn't his style. Just the two of them on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the recovered land in shades of gold and red. Marry me, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Lila turned to look at him. What? Marry me. Make this official. Build a life together instead of just kind of living parallel lives that happen to intersect. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard. You want romantic? Fine. He got down on one knee, ignoring her protests. Lila Mercer, you are the stubbornest, most infuriating, most remarkable woman I've ever met. You scare me and inspire me in equal measure, and I can't imagine spending the rest of my life with anyone else. Will you marry me? Lila started laughing, and then she was crying, and then she was pulling him up and kissing him. Yes, she said against his mouth. Yes, you impossible man. Yes. They were married in April in the school Lila had built. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, students and their parents, people who'd supported them through everything. Elena cried through the whole thing. Javier played guitar. Mrs. Garrett gave a speech about perseverance that was slightly too long but deeply felt. And when Lila stood there in her simple dress, not white, she wasn't that hypocritical. Holding Rowan's hands and promising to build a life with him, she thought about how far she'd come. 2 years ago, she'd stood on a platform in the center of town, being sold for grain. She'd been certain her life was over, that she'd never recover from the shame and humiliation. But here she was, married to a good man, running a thriving school, owning her own land, respected by the community that had once failed her. It wasn't perfect. She still had nightmares sometimes about the auction. She still felt a flash of fear when strangers looked at her too long. The scars didn't just disappear because things got better, but she'd learned to live with them, to incorporate them into who she was, instead of being defined by them. After the ceremony, as everyone celebrated with food and music and dancing, Lila found herself standing at the edge of it all, just watching. Rosa's children were running around with other students. Thomas was deep in conversation with Sheriff Bradshaw about curriculum. Mrs. Garrett was arguing good-naturedly with Javier about something, and Rowan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "Never." She leaned back against him. "Just taking it in. How different everything is from how it was." "Better different or worse different?" "Better. Definitely better." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for everything, for stepping up when nobody else would, for giving me space to heal, for building this life with me." "Thank you for letting me," Rowan said, "for being brave enough to try again after everything." They stood there together, watching their community celebrate, and Lila felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd built from the ashes of the worst thing that ever happened to her. The years that followed brought their own challenges, of course. Life didn't suddenly become easy just because Lila had won some battles. The school faced funding issues, enrollment fluctuations, the normal struggles of any small institution. Lila and Rowan had their share of arguments and disagreements, learning to merge two stubborn personalities into a functional partnership. But they faced it all together. The school kept growing. By its 5th year, Lila had 3 assistant teachers and nearly 60 students. They'd built a second building and established a small library. Some of her early students had gone on to attend universities back east, sending letters about their experiences and encouraging younger students to aim high. Miguel Garrett became a lawyer, the first in his family. Peter opened a successful carpentry business. Carmen became a teacher herself, returning to help Lila run the school that had given her a start. And Lila and Rowan built a life that was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. They had 2 children, a daughter born in the school's 3rd year, a son 2 years later. Both were raised knowing that their mother had survived something terrible and turned it into something beautiful. On the 10th anniversary of the school's opening, they held a celebration that drew people from all over the county. Former students came back to share their successes. Parents spoke about how the school had changed their children's lives. Even some people from Hackberry attended, including a few who'd stood silent during the auction. Lila gave a speech, standing in front of the crowd in the school she'd built. 10 years ago, I thought my life was over, she said. I thought the worst thing that could happen to a person had happened to me, and there was no coming back from it. I was wrong. She looked at Rowan, standing at the back with their children, at Elena and Javier, who'd become like family, at Mrs. Garrett, who'd taken a chance on her, at Thomas and Carmen and all the teachers who'd joined her mission. The worst thing that happened to me wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a different story. A harder story, but also a better one. She gestured to the school around them. This place exists because I survived, because people chose to help instead of looking away, because we all decided that what happened to me was wrong and we were going to do something about it. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I've learned a lot in these 10 years. I've learned that surviving isn't passive. It's the most active choice you can make. I've learned that building something good doesn't erase what was bad, but it gives the bad meaning. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about refusing to let what happened control your future. She looked out at the crowd, students and parents and friends, people whose lives had intersected with hers in ways big and small. Most importantly, I've learned that one person standing up can change everything. When Rowan stepped onto that platform and said, "This stops now," he drew a line. And that line became a foundation. And that foundation became this school, became this community, became proof that we could be better than our worst moments. There was applause and some crying, and Lila stepped down feeling like she'd finally said what needed saying. That night, after the celebration ended and everyone went home, Lila walked through the empty school. She ran her hands over the desks her students used, the slate board where she taught, the shelves full of books donated and purchased and loved. "You did good," Rowan said from the doorway. "We did good," she corrected automatically. He came to stand beside her. "You think about it sometimes? What would have happened if I hadn't stepped up that day?" "Sometimes, but not as much as I used to." She looked at him. "I used to think that day defined me, that I'd always be the woman who was sold for grain, but now," she gestured around the school, "now I'm the woman who built this, who taught hundreds of children, who survived and thrived and refused to stay down." "You're both," Rowan said. "You don't have to erase one to claim the other." He was right. She was both the woman on the platform and the woman in the school. The woman who'd been broken and the woman who'd healed. The victim and the survivor and the teacher and the wife and the mother and all the other things she'd become. All of it was true. All of it was her. Years continued to pass. The children grew. The school evolved. Lila kept teaching, though as she got older, she focused more on training new teachers than managing classrooms. She wrote a book about education on the frontier, drawing on her experiences and philosophy. It was published by a small press in Austin and became required reading in several teacher training programs. Rowan's ranch prospered, benefiting from good rains and smart management. They never got rich, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were content. And every year, on the anniversary of that terrible day in Hackberry, Lila would stand on the porch and look at the land she owned, the school she'd built, the life she'd made. Not to celebrate the trauma, but to acknowledge how far she'd come. Because that was the truth nobody talked about. Surviving terrible things didn't make you special. It just made you someone who'd survived terrible things. What mattered was what you did with the survival. Did you let it destroy you? Did you use it as an excuse to give up? Or did you take that pain and transform it into something that helped other people avoid the same fate? Lila had chosen transformation. She'd taken her humiliation and turned it into education, her powerlessness into empowerment, her worst day into the foundation for thousands of better days. On her 70th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren and former students who'd become teachers and lawyers and business owners and farmers, Lila looked back on her life with something close to satisfaction. It hadn't been the life she'd planned. It had been harder and stranger and more painful than anything she'd imagined as a young woman coming west to teach. But it had been hers. Fully, completely, undeniably hers. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the platform or the rope or the faces that had turned away, but what came after: the school, the students, the community, the family, the legacy of a woman who'd been knocked down and had chosen every single day to get back up. The school outlasted her, of course. It became an institution, eventually incorporating with the county system, but maintaining its core mission: education for anyone who wanted it, regardless of background or circumstance. They named it the Mercer School, and above the door they placed a plaque with words Lila had written near the end of her life. This school stands on the belief that every person deserves dignity, opportunity, and the chance to rise above their circumstances. May all who enter here find the courage to claim the life they deserve. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't fancy, but it was true. And in a world that too often valued appearance over substance, flash over foundation, easy answers over hard truths, that truth was worth preserving. Because here's what Lila Mercer learned in her 78 years on Earth. Your worst moment doesn't define you unless you let it. People are capable of terrible things and wonderful things, sometimes in the same breath. Survival is a choice you make every day, not a one-time decision. And the line between victim and victor isn't fixed. It's something you draw yourself every time you choose to stand up instead of staying down. The drought ended. The rain came back. The land healed. And a woman who'd once been sold for a sack of grain became a teacher, a wife, a mother, a leader, a legend. Not because what happened to her was special, but because what she did with what happened was extraordinary. She turned trauma into teaching, humiliation into hope, powerlessness into purpose. And in doing so, she proved that the worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to be the last thing that defines you. Sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and brave enough and lucky enough to find people who'll stand with you, it can be the first chapter of something better. Not perfect, not painless, but better. And that, in the end, is enough.